Shakespeare from a Marxist perspective, which is a really interesting subject, actually, because Marx was very influenced by Shakespeare, and his writings show references to Marx. Just a quick quote, which I stumbled across when I prepared for this session, from Marx's son-in-law, Paul Lafargue, who was writing about how obsessed Marx was with Shakespeare. His respect for Shakespeare was boundless. He made a detailed study of his works and knew even the least important of his characters. His whole family had a real cult for the great English dramatist. His 3 daughters knew many of his works by heart. When after 1848 he wanted to perfect his knowledge of English, which he could already read, he thought out and classified all Shakespeare's original expressions. His nickname, Moore, was a reference to Othello, etc. So it's a really an interesting link between those two. And I'm really looking forward to this opening now. Over to you, Roger.
First, I can at last reveal the true identity of Shakespeare. The plays of Shakespeare were written by a man called William Shakespeare. It's sheer reactionary snobbery to suggest that his poetry and plays could only have been written by an aristocrat. On the contrary, an aristocrat of that time would have written from a very different perspective. Shakespeare was the son of a prosperous craftsman, an entrepreneur, and mayor of a thriving provincial town. He has too often become, for generations of young people, an instrument of mental torture inflicted by Philistine examination boards via a compliant school brainwashing system. And as for part of my life as an English teacher, I've seen too many schools force their students into utterly pointless dissections of dead texts by linguistic analysis, digging up metaphors and dramatic irony and alliteration and iambic pentameter, treating them as anything other than dramatic entertainment. It's as if you evaluated Michelangelo frescoes in terms of the chemical composition of the paint. Plays are not meant to be read, let alone analysed, but first of all, performed. Now, Shakespeare was an actor and the manager of a theatre company. He deployed his talents to fit the needs of his time, and his very quality of empathy left him impervious to the demands of partisan allegiances. He wrote to entertain the crowds, sometimes pandering to the whims of the royal patrons who sponsored his productions, but always with his finger on the pulse of a society on the brink of massive upheavals. Everyone wants to claim Shakespeare as their own, as an advocate of the divine right of kings, or alternatively, as a champion of democratic human rights, as a secret Catholic subversive, or as a sycophant of the new Protestant ascendancy, as a conservative advocate of royal privilege, or as a forerunner of the coming parliamentarian uprising, as an upstart plebeian entrepreneur, or as a clandestine aristocratic courtier masquerading under a pseudonym. Now, we, for our part, will not cannibalise his memory. How much could the mayor of a provincial English town at the turn of the 17th century have in common with Marxism? Shakespeare was certainly not a pamphleteer. What he was a dramatist with an uncanny ability to penetrate deep into the mind of whatever character crossed his stage. And let's look at some examples. How else could he start with, for instance, the caricatured racial stereotypes of a miserly, vengeful Jewish moneylender, or of a hot-blooded black man manipulated into murdering his wife, and yet, at the same time, enter so utterly and completely into their psyche? Can Shakespeare really speak to us 400 years later as he did to his contemporaries? First of all, I'd say in his comedies, the answer is no, not really. Schools often start children off with comedies like A Midsummer Night's Dream or Twelfth Night or Much Ado About Nothing, in the delusion that these will offer an easy, fun way for them to get started. Unfortunately, the problem is that after 400 years, the old jokes just aren't funny anymore. Humour mutates with each successive generation. The jokes that I found funny in my youth left my elders cold. Tell the same ones to kids nowadays, and they just don't work. Humour tends to titillate the thinly repressed secrets peculiar to each successive generation. And for all the scintillating brilliance of Shakespeare's wordplay, these elaborate operettas of cross-dressing, mistaken identities, excruciating puns, and multiple marriages seem to us very distant, dated period pieces. Tragedy, on the other hand, strikes a chord throughout the ages. The relentless cycle in Shakespeare's tragedies of war, death, betrayal, and bereavement has the same timeless, devastating impact today as it did in his lifetime. Let's focus first on one of Shakespeare's best-known plays, Macbeth. It operates on an extraordinary weave of multiple layers. At its most basic level, it's a simple horror story, complete with witches, ghosts, murderers, black magic, which entertained the crowds just as modern horror movies do. But it was so much more than that. On another level, of course, it was an opportunistic gesture of obsequious deference towards the new king, James I, the king imported from Scotland after the death of the childless Tudor Queen Elizabeth, hence the Scottish play. The storyline can also be seen as a straightforward narration of historical facts. Duncan, Macbeth, and Banquo are real historical figures. The battle referenced in the opening scene against what is called the Norwegians was one of several battles to resist the periodic incursions on Scottish territory by the Vikings. But it was also a deliberate falsification of history. Duncan was in reality just one of a succession of countless rival gangster warlords jockeying for power. He too had become king simply by killing his predecessor, just as he was killed in turn by Macbeth to take his throne. But the flattery and the deliberate deception doesn't stop there. The witches are shown predicting that Banquo shall get kings though thou be none. Now, what's the point of that detail? The fact that King James really was the 8th generation descendant of Banquo. But there's one important little revision that Shakespeare made to the story. Banquo is portrayed in the play as a hero and an innocent victim of Macbeth, while the actual historical truth is that the real Banquo was actually an accomplice together with Macbeth, equally guilty of the murder of King Duncan. But that too is not all. In other ways too, the play shows a sycophantic deference to James. For a start, it indulged his perverse and paranoid obsession with witchcraft. It was James who was soon to initiate a reign of sheer terror and mass hysteria in which thousands of women were tortured, mutilated, burned alive, or drowned. These old village women were the living link to centuries of rural wisdom and folk medicine. The orgy of witch hunting was not just an outbreak of mass hysteria, it was designed to wipe out all traces of pagan pre-Christian traditions and to entrench through a reign of terror the absolute domination of the Protestant Church. Note, for instance, that among the foul ingredients itemized in the witch's cauldron, as listed in their famous incantation, bubble, bubble, toil, and trouble, are included the following: liver of blaspheming Jew, and nose of Turk and Tartar's lips. Of course, Turks were the archetypal Muslims, and the Tartars were another name for Genghis Khan's Muslim Mongol invaders who had occupied most of Europe. So they were symbols of rival religious cultures which had to be cursed, exorcised, and stamped out mercilessly. But on yet another level too, Shakespeare's plot was consciously crafted to suit the immediate political agenda of the ruling class. This was the crucial period of revolutionary conflict and transition and metamorphosis. British society was convulsed by the death agony of feudalism and the painful birth pangs of capitalism. The rise of the merchant class, the class into which Shakespeare was born, and, let's repeat, very definitely not that of the Earl of Essex or any of the other aristocrats that some people have tried to shoehorn into Shakespeare's place. In ideological terms, this conflict was projected onto the religious plane, and perhaps the one single most dramatic event in this social transition, an alarming tremor anticipating the social earthquake to come, had taken place just months before the production of this play. Now, that immediate shock, one which shook the establishment to its core and haunted it literally for centuries to come, an event which is still memorialized every year over 400 years later on Bonfire Night, was Guy Fawkes's Gunpowder Plot, which the previous year had literally almost blasted the entire state machine sky high. It was an audacious act of terror that had an impact comparable to that of 9/11 in modern times. If Catesby, Fawkes and their Catholic conspirators had succeeded in blowing up Parliament on 5th of November 1605, the day of its official royal opening, the entire state, King, Lords, Parliament and bureaucrats, would have been vaporized. So what does this have to do with Macbeth? The answer is absolutely everything. The reference is hammered home in almost every line of the play. How? By using a device, the significance of which may mean little to a modern audience, but whose impact to a contemporary audience would have been crystal clear. The constant theme throughout the play, the motif running through almost every other line, that of equivocation. It's a constant motif, saying one thing, meaning the opposite. Double talk. The opening words of the play are, "Fair is foul and foul is fair." The opening lines spoken by Macbeth when he first appears on stage are, "So foul and fair a day I have not seen." Every one of the witch's predictions has contradictory levels of meaning, a conclusion that Macbeth reaches only too late, tormenting himself with the awful realization that their tricks and deceptions and double talk have destroyed him. He says, "I begin to doubt the equivocation of the fiend that lies like truth." And later, "Be these juggling fiends no more believed, that palter with us in a double sense, that keep the word of promise to our ear and break it to our hope." There are constant variations on this theme on almost every page of the play, even the ghoulish scene of comic relief, when the drunken porter stumbles onto the initial murder scene, jokes that drink is, as he puts it, an equivocator, because it heightens sexual desire, but dampens sexual performance. So, why this constant motif of equivocation? What on earth has this got to do with the contemporary context? What's the connection? It may seem obscure, but it will soon become relevant. It's this. The conspiracy behind the Gunpowder Plot was planned by a secret society of Catholics, the Society of Jesus, known as the Jesuits. Members of this cabal were at the time of Macbeth's first performance now on the run from state terror, and each of them carried with them a booklet of coded instructions from the Jesuits, a secret treatise on how to evade police interrogation. It advised its members that under police questioning, rather than commit the sin of outright perjury, they should resort to ambiguity, evasion, and double entendre, in other words, equivocation. They were neither to confess nor to lie, but to prevaricate. And what was its title? The title of this booklet? On Equivocation. So the reference to equivocation and its constant deployment in the play would have been immediately appreciated in the feverish mood of the time, when Catesby and Fawkes were seen as genuinely frightening, sinister bogeymen comparable to Osama bin Laden or ISIS in more recent times. So Macbeth thrilled its audience as much as any modern horror movie, but it also shamelessly flattered the new Scottish King James, who was soon to instigate a very real countrywide witch-hunting hysteria. And that's why he cast in the role of a paragon of virtue Macbeth's actual historical accomplice in regicide. He colluded in stoking up a mass frenzy of revenge against the terrorist monster of his day, and he exposed their advocacy of the practice of equivocation as a tactic to be used to evade self-incrimination. Now, I've concentrated on Macbeth. Similar commentaries could be composed for many of Shakespeare's best plays: Hamlet, King Lear, Othello, Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar, The Merchant of Venice. School teachers, of course, drone on pedantically about these plays as if they were mere regurgitations from the rules of the ancient Greeks. Almost all of them subscribe to the hackneyed doctrine that they all fit the templates of great heroes brought to ruin with inexorable inevitability by their own fatal flaws. And actually, this completely misses the mark. The agonizing dilemmas faced by Lear, Brutus, Hamlet, Henry V, Romeo, and many more all arise from the irreconcilable clash between the growing aspirations of the individual on the one hand and the rigid demands of a hidebound state against which he is rebelling, a tension which is already bursting society at its seams. This is a recurring theme in Shakespeare's plays. For instance, in Romeo and Juliet, in which Verona's rival, lawless, warring mafia street gangs defy the flagging authority of the prince's laws, and the young lovers rebel against the authority of their parents. In Hamlet, which portrays the adolescent rebellion of a prince against his stepfather, the illegitimate murderous king. In Julius Caesar, a study of conspiracy, assassination, and civil war. Shakespeare depicted, and that's the answer to the person who said, what's this to do with Marxism? Shakespeare depicted the growing antagonisms threatening to tear apart a hidebound, moribund, rotting feudal structure. Remember that England was soon to become the first country since classical times to chop off the head of a king. Now, it's true that wherever they appear in these plays, the common masses are depicted as raucous, fickle, and malleable. In Julius Caesar, they're swayed within minutes from one allegiance to another, first by the plain-spoken oratory of Brutus, and then by the manipulative rhetoric of Mark Antony. Shakespeare was no democrat. And yet in all his best plays, you can hear, and there again is the answer, the approaching rumble of civil war, the stripping for all time of dynastic authority. I'll give a couple of examples, then I'll finish. What does the young King Henry V say while in disguise? He says, "I think the king is but a man as I am. In his nakedness he appears but a man." In King Lear, Shakespeare literally strips a king naked and sends him raving and delirious into a storm-drenched wilderness, accompanied only by a clown and a blind madman. And in this play, above all, he presents an unmistakable image where royalty is literally stripped of all its trappings to reveal a poor, vulnerable, pathetic old weakling. Again, listen to these words of Lear. "They told me I was everything. 'Tis a lie. I'm a very foolish, fond old man." And then again, "Here I stand, your slave, a poor, infirm, weak, and despised old man." And he even says, "Thou hast seen a farmer's dog bark at a beggar, and the creature run from the cur. There thou mightst behold the great image of authority. A dog's obeyed in office." In other words, even a dog, if you give it the title, then ordinary, non-aristocratic mortals will fear and cringe before it. So these plays could not have been written either a century earlier or a century later. They could only have grown out of the soil of a society just one generation away from civil war. And they encompass all the poetry, passion, and intensity of a society on the brink of revolution. Right. Thanks, comrades.
Thank you very much, Roger. There's been a bit of a hoo-ha in the in the chat. Comrades are taking exception to you dismissing his comedies. But a couple of comrades, Luke, I'm going to bring him in quickly.
Hello, good evening.
Hi.
I didn't expect this. I'm a little bit unprepared, but I'll do my best. Thank you, Roger, for the presentation. Very stimulating, and it's great to see others take such an interest in Shakespeare's work and its relevance for us today. I must say, though, I was a bit disappointed by the rather casual dismissal of the wonderful comedies and their profound relevance to issues of gender, above all today, and patriarchy. If you take, for example, the cross-dressing you mentioned, Roger, I don't see it as something quaint at all. I see it as an incredibly innovative device, way ahead of its time, for exploring the boundaries of gender. And we see this very clearly in Twelfth Night with Viola and Olivia, and the incredible confusion that arises in gender relations because of the cross-dressing. Of course, the cross-dressing is on one level, it's a merely practical device, because we had boy act in Shakespeare's theatre, women were not allowed to take part. And Shakespeare got round this, if you like, by the device of cross-dressing. But at the same time, cross-dressing gives him the opportunity to explore what it means to be a stereotypical woman, and the freedom, the empowerment which a woman acquires when she's dressed as a man and acquires another voice. You see this particularly with Rosalind. Rosalind in As You Like It is a massive role for females. And every great actress of our time has always wanted to play Rosalind, as they've wanted to play Cleopatra, as they've wanted to play Viola, and all the female characters, almost with and Othello. I mean, there are so many ways in which Shakespeare gives females a voice at the same time as having to struggle against the typical patriarchal view of women who should know their place. I mean, Taming of the Shrew is a fascinating example of this contradiction. On the one hand, it's a comedy. You dismissed the comedies. I think Taming of the Shrew is a wonderful starting point for discussion. It's despised by some, and some people say it shouldn't be put on at all nowadays because of the taming by Petruchio of Caterina. But at the same time, Shakespeare is full of contradictions, and this is very Marxian. And I think Marx would have appreciated the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis that you get in Shakespeare's comedies. He takes a proposition, the typical, if you like, traditional feudal view of a woman's place, and he constantly questions this. He does it in A Midsummer Night's Dream. You mentioned A Midsummer Night's Dream. This is one of the most powerful ways in which Shakespeare shows he can explore the limits of eroticism, and he can give women a voice in this battle of the sexes, and all within a framework of patriarchal authority, which time after time Shakespeare's women challenge. This is profoundly Marxist for me. And to dismiss the comedies and their exploration of the antiquated, if you like, framework of patriarchy, I think it's a shame, because there are so many treasures there. There are so many things that we can learn from in discussing. I'm not saying there's a one-dimensional, positive presentation of women by any means in Shakespeare. There are tensions, there are contradictions, and I think Marx is all about contradictions and resolving them through struggle. And the device of cross-dressing does allow Shakespeare to give women a powerful voice. And you can see that he is preoccupied with this issue when you look at the sonnets. You take a sonnet like My Mistress' Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun. You take a sonnet like, the Master Mistress sonnet. A woman's face with nature's own hand painted, hast thou, the master mistress of my passion. There he's in the sonnet doing what he does in the comedies, which is to explore the if you like, the blurred distinction between gender. He doesn't present gender as black and white and absolute. And I think that's incredibly 21st century and postmodern, if you like. So if we look at the sonnets and what he does there with the young, fair youth, and we look at the comedies at the same time, we can see a line of connection. And it's about exploring the end of an old feudal order and the rise of a new middle class where roles in society are being redefined. constrained largely through developments in the economy and shifting social classes. And again, can I just mention, well, I've said enough for the time being. I'd also like to come back to the rather unquestioning dismissal of the authorship question, which I would have expected a Marxist to have a more critical approach toward. It's a very misguided view from what I'm a skeptic, and I'm not an aristocrat. I'm a left-winger, and I think, on the contrary, the traditional view of the authorship is a reactionary view which reinforces the establishment perception of Shakespeare, who does not challenge the current structures of power. Whereas those who question the traditional story, you often find, are exploring far deeper into class distinctions in Shakespeare through the conflict between the aristocracy, the middle classes, and ordinary working people. I think I've said enough, but thank you, Roger, for the presentation.
Thank you very much, Luke. I mean, we want this series to be, where we question each other very much. So you're very welcome also to prepare another session if you fancy, where you present a different point of view. We put you a little bit on the spot there. So if you want another, yeah, fantastic. I'll get in touch with you. I've got your email now. Thank you. Ian, you wanted to say something.
Firstly, thank you, Roger Silverman. I wish you taught me Shakespeare. It was brilliant. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I had the great good fortune, despite going to a crappy London Comprehensive, it had a really good drama department. And we regularly used to go out to watch Shakespeare plays at the open air theatre in London. This was before the Globe had been built. And one of my drama teachers, who happened to be a communist, said, Shakespeare is ours. He wrote for ordinary working people. He didn't write for people who spoke like this and make grand gestures and strange kind of intonation. They were just all. And when subsequently the Globe Theatre was built, with the help of a communist, by the way, Sam Wanamaker was kicked out of the USA because because of the McCarthy witch hunt. Came to Britain and was able to get a living, like so many actors who were driven out of the United States. His great love of Shakespeare and his in a sense his gratitude for Britain providing him with a home was a guiding force behind the development of the Globe Theatre. And I still recommend to anybody to go and watch Shakespeare at the Globe, because you get a feel for what it might have been like. I've sat there stood there, because I like going in the groundlings, where you just pay a nominal fee to, and you stand through the performance, but you can boo and you can hiss and you and that kind of stuff. So the other thing was, I too also happen to love the comedies. I find, though, that the problem is that the directors often murder the comedy, and of course it's down to the skill of the director as much as anything else. But there's also quite a lot of comedy, even in the tragedies, because of course Shakespeare used comedy for relief along the way. The famous one. And it's one, sadly, which is often cut out by contemporary directors, because it's almost as if they're frightened to put the comedy in, as if we're too stupid to understand it or something like this.
Can I say something about this?
Yeah, in a minute. Let me finish.
Yeah, okay, of course.
Yeah, shut your face. And in the Gravedigger scene, for example, in Hamlet, there's a little line which I quite like. He said, Hamlet asked the gravedigger, "How long may a man lie in his grave ere he rot?" And the gravedigger replies, "Oh, in faith, if he be not rotten before he die, as we have a good many pocky courses now a days that will scarce hold the lying in." And then he goes on to say, he will last some 8 years or 9 years. This was a direct reference to syphilis, which was quite widespread in Shakespeare's time, and the audience would have fell about, because the idea of you catch the pox and your nose rots off and all this kind of stuff was a generalized feature. Now, there's an advantage to doing some sort of textual analysis, because otherwise you miss some of the bright spots. And there's a lot of really, really funny lines throughout Shakespeare, in both the comedies and the tragedies. But it's just one of the things I really hated when I was involved in Marxist politics in a certain northern city, which remain nameless, is that quite often you get something that's supposed to be kind of political, and it would be kind of a you'd be lectured to from the stage, as it were, by people who, this is written by an ordinary working man, and this kind of stuff, ignoring the fact that the classics are just full of stuff which is of direct relevance to us and was written for us, and it's utterly beautiful. And thank you, Roger. It was an excellent presentation.
Tam wanted to say something as well.
Yeah, just draw people's attention to what I posted in the chat. There's an absolutely fantastic talk, especially on the comedies, by a guy called Jacob Fischel, who's in New York, but a wonderful Shakespeare expert, that he gave to the radical anthropology group called The Anthropology of Shakespeare. And I've learned so much from that, because like Ian, I've found that most of the comedies that I have seen just didn't hit the mark, and were sort of, it made it understandable what Roger was saying. But I just wanted to draw attention as well to what I've discovered about Shakespeare and his influence in Gaza. There's a wonderful Gaza monologue called From Gaza to Shakespeare. It starts off, "Help me, my friend, how can you be present? After more than 500 years, you jump before my eyes with every image and every cry. I hear you screaming with the children and sharing their crying with the mothers, dressed in black like Hamlet's father, emerging from under the rubble carrying a child's toy." If you go to the Gaza monologue site, you'll find all that. And Rifat Alaria, who was assassinated in December, on YouTube, there's a whole range of his lectures on Shakespeare to his students in Gaza, who he encouraged them to learn English and to study Shakespeare. And there's a wonderful book called Enter Ghost, Isabella Hamad, about a production of Hamlet going on in the West Bank. And I was hoping that we were going to there was going to be a Shakespeare celebration on his birthday, April the 23rd, where all this would be raised in where it all started, before the Globe, where Ian was talking about, in Shoreditch. I was a member of the Shakespeare in Shoreditch Society, and on the 400th anniversary to the day when it moved from the theatre to the Globe, we did a production written by an amazing actor who played Mercutio in Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet, John McHenry. That he wrote a play about a production of Tamburlaine being rehearsed, and the bailiff's at the door, so they have to give up. And I was in this production. We did it. It was between Christmas and New Year, late 90s, and we then marched from Shoreditch to the Globe with two wooden beams represented what they took from there. And we marched through the city. Between Christmas and New Year, the whole place is dead. But we had two oxen taking these down through the city, and Mark Rylance was waiting for us at the Globe to celebrate that. That was an extraordinary event. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. But this is great. Yes, great chat.
Thank you, Tam. Roger, do you want to reply to? Oh, I think Luke wanted to say something briefly. In addition.
Well, there's so much we could say, and I don't want to monopolize. The previous speaker just mentioned Mark Rylance. Mark Rylance is not an aristocrat. He's not reactionary. is one of our great Shakespearean actors and has devoted his life to Shakespeare. And he's a Shakespeare skeptic concerning the authorship. I think we should bear that in mind. And many other great actors of today, including Derek Jacobi. I don't think they're snobs. And I actually think from a Marxist perspective, there is much more mileage to be got from recognizing the true nature of Elizabethan theatre as having its roots in the aristocracy, in the sense that Shakespeare's plays were not first performed in the Globe. They were first performed for the Queen. They were performed in the palace. He's a court poet, and a courtly poet above all, and a courtly playwright. Once we understand that, and there's a book by Richard Dutton, a great mainstream Shakespearean scholar, called Shakespeare Court Playwright. I recommend we have a look at it, because he explodes the myth that Shakespeare wrote primarily for the masses. He has nothing but contempt for the masses. And we must recognize this. This is not what Marx liked about Shakespeare. He does time and again show he has no respect, and he thinks they're good for a laugh. They smell, their breath smells. He brings them in when he explores the riots which followed from the dearth, from the famine in those times in Coriolanus. And this is what we should be looking at, what he does with them in Julius Caesar, in Coriolanus. This is an aristocratic perspective. He's an aristocrat through and through in his ideology. I don't know who wrote the plays, but the ideology of the plays, if we're talking from a Marxist perspective, is the ideology of a feudal cast of mind which sees the feudal order crumbling and sees the rising middle class taking the place of the corrupt and bankrupt aristocracy. So the comedies, it's misleading to think that comedy in Shakespeare means laughter. It doesn't. It means at the end of a comedy, people get married. At the end of a tragedy, they die. This is the essential, quintessential distinction, not that it is funny. Because as a previous speaker mentioned, Shakespeare mixes comedy and tragedy in all of his plays. The tragedies are full of comedy. And the point is about the comedies that they end in harmony, sometimes a very forced harmony. It's particularly in The Taming of the Shrew, for example, and in the problem plays. The harmony which is forced upon them begs a lot of questions. And this is what I find is radical about Shakespeare, the gaps in Shakespeare, the contradictions in Shakespeare. And we should mention Timon of Athens, which was Marx's favorite Shakespeare play, and the exploration of the power of gold. And it's all done through the perspective of the ruling class, Roger. It is not done through the perspective of working people. There's nothing snobbish about saying these plays are redolent of respect for the monarchy, respect for the hierarchical order of society, at the same time as exploring and questioning that hierarchy. This is exactly what Hamlet is. Hamlet is a feudal prince, and it's the voice of the feudal prince which is questioning the rotten state of the establishment of Denmark in that particular play. So I think historical facts should be of great interest to Marxists, and we should not repeat the myths of the traditional establishment view about Shakespeare from Stratford, about whom we know virtually nothing. And we have this ridiculous theory of a genius who made it all up and wrote 37 plays about court life, and not a single play about working people, and not a single play apart from the Merry Wives of Windsor about the middle classes, vaguely. So this is odd. This is odd in a working chap from Stratford, and I grew up near Stratford, and I made the pilgrimage to Stratford many, many times in my life. And I taught the myth of Shakespeare, the uncritical view of Shakespeare. It's time we really brought Shakespeare into the 21st century and recognized him as somebody who is deeply embedded in the politics of his time. And if you ignore the court politics, you ignore the political aspect of Shakespeare. The whole perspective of the plays is of somebody who's familiar with the struggle for power in the court, and in the comedies, the conflict between patriarchy and the female characters. But if we begin from the point of view that he wrote for the masses, for which there is no evidence, as I say, I will end with the comment at the beginning. He has nothing but contempt for the masses. This does not make him of no interest to a Marxist like myself, a fairly amateur Marxist, may I say, but I find his relevance is profound, as it was to Marx himself, not because he wrote for the people or from the perspective of the people, but because he showed the cracks and the contradictions in the established order of the Tudor dynasty and then the Jacobean dynasty after that. Thank you once again, Roger. I think I should shut up now.
Interesting point of view. I'm glad we're having this discussion. Roger, now
Yes.
you can.
Well, look, there's a lot of things. Luke, thank you for very stimulating and provocative points that you're making. But with all due respect, you either you weren't listening properly to what I said, or I didn't put it over properly. But I never said, in fact, I explicitly denied that Shakespeare was a friend of the masses. I said I can find the text of what I said in a minute. I referred, for instance, to Julius Caesar and the Brutus and Mark Antony speaking to the crowd, and I said, on the contrary, he shows no respect and no faith in the masses at all. He portrays them as being completely gullible, swayed, really just putty in the hands of the orators, first of Brutus and then of Mark Antony. I didn't say that he was any friend of the working classes. I said that he was, but I did say that he was showing the collapse and the breakdown of the old feudal monarchic structure and anticipating the revolution and the civil war that was coming. And I think that is the only way that can be explained. And when you say, the traditional view, I was not putting a traditional view at all. The traditional view, the one that is always taught by the mainstream, is always that Shakespeare is somehow sort of timeless. And as I think I quoted again at the beginning, the idea of Greek tragedy, that all he's doing is showing heroes, great people with one single fatal flaw which undermines them. And I was saying it's nothing to do with that. It's absolutely not. What it is about is again and again, and I gave a fair number of quotes which I think backs up the idea that he was talking about the complete collapse of the old monarchical structure and hierarchy, and anticipating the revolution that was coming and the civil war, which doesn't mean that he had faith in the working class, but it does mean that he was anticipating and again, that's why the question of authorship comes in, because the traditional idea all that I've heard of what people who say, oh, it wasn't Shakespeare couldn't have done that, he was he couldn't have had the education, he was from a middle class background, only an aristocrat would have known, would have been familiar with Latin and all the history and so on. I mean, the fact is that that idea comes from prejudices of people who do not understand the significance of Shakespeare's play in terms of his finger on the pulse of the coming bourgeois revolution, the coming civil war, and the breakup of feudal society. As for the comedies, by the way, I didn't say they weren't any good. I said they don't work so well for a modern audience, and they don't. And the reason, all I was saying, I made my comment that humor is very ephemeral. It changes very much from generation to generation. And what seemed funny 400 years ago doesn't really work. And I'm saying that as the experience of teaching in schools, where so many schools start by saying, oh well, let's give them a nice easy introduction by letting them watch What Much Ado About Nothing or something, and it's completely confusing. It's just so difficult for them to follow, and the humour, they just don't find it funny. And maybe there's something wrong with me, but for me, I just don't think it works. And I think for most people, it's the same thing. The tragedy, on the other hand, immediately they strike, and I agree, of course, there's comedy in the tragedies, and I suppose to some extent vice versa. But I mean, I quoted the comic scene in Macbeth where the porter knockabout farce almost of the drunken porter coming in just at that fatal moment, just after the murder of Duncan. There is humour, of course, in the tragedies and so on, but the comedies themselves are very, very stylized, and they belong to an era so removed that they actually are. I don't think that they have much impact nowadays. Maybe other people see it a different way. Maybe, I mean, I would very much like to hear a lead off by Luke, on putting his point of view, although we got quite a lot of it tonight too. And maybe I can come in perhaps, and we can have a bit of a debate.
Sounds very interesting. Thank you very much, Roger, and thank you, Luke, Tam, Ian, all contributed to this discussion.